The Beast of Tuksa, written by Trent Knuga and Elizabeth Moon. Prologue. It is quite well known that when a child falls from the sky in the land of Speria, they are to be taken to the monastery at Crescent Isle to learn to control their powerful supernatural abilities. Their fate not yet sealed, some of these children are thought to be cursed, outcast from society, and deemed to be evil by nature. In the enclosed valley of Tuksa, one such child has just begun his journey. Chapter 1. The Dark Forest.
Mao looked up and could faintly make out the lowermost branches of trees passing overhead, lit only by the limited reach of Oliff's torch. His own had begun to flicker. The slender tree limbs spun out like mangled claws hanging above them ominously. In front of them, twisted coiling tree trunks protruded from the blanket of blue mist along the forest floor. If there ever was any kind of actual path or road, it had been lost long ago. "Watch your steps," said Oliff, as Mao tripped over something hard and hollow. Looking behind him, he thought he saw a skull buried in the black dirt covered in wet moss. Oliff hacked mercilessly at the thicket of dead bushes ahead of them with a large machete. The dangling pans from his oversized rucksack shuffled from side to side as he swung. He took off his twill farmer's hat for a moment and smiled through his bushy beard. "All right, guys, now stand back," he said to Mao and their faithful dog Bartol. Between slashes, he held out his walking stick, which had a curious twist to it. At the top end, he had wrapped old rags and doused it with accelerant to fashion a very tall torch rod. He stabbed it into the dirt and boosted Mao up over a large row of boulders that were otherwise impassable. 9 years ago, Mao had fallen from the night sky, and everything had changed. Back then, Oliff was a different person, with a different life. Back then, he still had a farm, and spent a lot of time in town. He smiled as Mao helped him and Bartol down the other side of the rock. "Thanks, my boy." He had lost the farm, but he had gained something else entirely. As he climbed over the apex, his wet boots lost footing. When he slid down the mossy rock face, a small book tumbled out from his pocket and landed in the soft forest floor beneath a thin layer of fog. For a moment he panicked. He leapt to his knees and fished around through the misty forest floor. When he finally held it in his hand, he let out a sigh of relief and paused to stare at it. He wiped the mud off the front cover. It was green, worn with age, and had ruffled pages sticking out of the sides. The title was scribbled on the front of the book in elegant handwriting, "The Spearian Traveler." Mao slid down the rock surface with ease. "What's with the book?" But Oliff simply coughed. "Oh, this? It's nothing. Just a bit of light reading for the road." Then he stuffed the small book in his inside coat pocket, where he also carried a lot of strange trinkets and other odd things. Mao nose kept twitching. The rotten stink was overwhelming to him, and it made him quite miserable. In fact, his senses had been going haywire ever since the moment they'd crossed the first fence on the border of the dark forest. He could hear the buzzing of hundreds of thousands of insects scattering here and there. He felt the wind fluttering between branches and over roots. He tried to block it all out, but he could not. Came a sound, subtle and distant, like something dragging claws into wood, long and slow. He knew that Oliff most likely couldn't hear it. After all, he was human, and Mao was something different. He decided not to talk about it. Mao's feet stuck in the mud so deeply that they created a suction noise every time he lifted his tattered shoes. "The trick," Oliff leaned back and said smugly, "is to step right in the middle of the puddle. That's the most level ground. If you try to step around it, you'll most likely slip and break an ankle, or smash your head on a rock." Mao ignored him and continued stumbling so much that Oliff had to stop and wait for him to catch up repeatedly. He leaned his shoulder in and smacked it a couple of times, giving Mao a welcoming grin. "Here you go, bud. Why don't you let me carry you?" "Ah!" Mao walked past him and rolled his eyes so hard that his whole head turned. "I hate it when you carry me." Just then his shoe lost traction, sending him face first into the mud puddle. "I guess you're getting along just fine then," Oliff chuckled, his grin hidden beneath his beard. Mao wiped his face and spit the dirt from his mouth. Every step he took from then on, he was quite focused on balancing his footing in the middle of the puddles. But the whole thing was quite embarrassing for him, and he was eager to change the subject of conversation as he attempted to brush lumps of muck from his clothes. "Do you think we'll ever go back?" "What, to Tuksa?" Oliff raised one eyebrow and looked back over his shoulder. "Would you ever want to go back?" Mao shrugged. "I guess, but only if we had to." It made Oliff's heart sink to think of how poorly the Tuksans had treated the young moonkin. They never once made him feel welcome in all of his years in the valley. "No, I don't reckon we'll ever go back. Some things just can't be mended. Besides, there won't be much there after a year or two without any harvest. That fire spread clear through the valley." He paused in his tracks for a moment, staring off into the distance. All of them crops. What a shame. They both grew silent for a short while. Oliff continued to chop through the twigs and thick branches. Mao had felt the loss too, but more than that, he knew what the farm had meant to Oliff. It was the only home that either of them had ever known. He felt a pit gather up in his stomach. He had made a conscious decision not to hate them for what they had done, but this was also in part because he blamed himself. "I'm sure things will be different in Crescent Isle," Mao said. "I'll miss the old farm, though. It wasn't so bad when it was just the three of us." He looked over at the nervous Bartol, who was too busy darting his head at every little noise that he heard. For all his strong shoulders and sharp teeth, Bartol shivered and whined at every twig that had cracked beneath their feet. Mao wiped his hand on his shirt and rubbed the dog's ears. Bartol leaned his head into it, seemingly comforted by the gesture. "I could ride Bartol all the way around the fences of the forest faster than any horse. Isn't that right, Barty?" "Maybe a little too close if you ask me," said Oliff. "Them fences ain't just for keeping folks out of the forest, you know." Bartol's tail began to whip around as he ran in a circle around Mao. Even with all the satchels and gourds strapped to his back, he was ready to run. It was, in fact, his favorite thing to do. "The dark forest," Mao said. "You always told me to stay away from this place." Oliff looked back out of the corner of his eye. "Folks from Tuksa reckon it's haunted, possessed by some spirit. Place of nightmares." He paused for a moment to wipe the sweat from his forehead. "That's why they built the wall around their town, really. Tried cutting it down, even tried burning it. But it only made it mad, they said. Some claim it grew into the valley even further. And I've been told so many stories of hunting parties gone missing and seen so many mangled, half-eaten bodies come out of the dark forest. I can't help but think there's something evil in this place." He paused to look around at the trees as if he were an ant looking out for a boot. "Nah, if there were any other way out of Tuksa, we would have taken it." "Well," Mao said as he reached into his pocket, took out an apple, and took a bite, "I ain't afraid." "No, you're not, are you?" Oliff laughed as he continued to hack away at the bushes. "But I tell you, just 'cause you ain't scared don't mean it ain't dangerous." He turned back to look at him with a grin. "And I ain't always going to be right next to you to save you." Mao continued casually chewing at the apple. "That's not so bad. Nothing but mud puddles and mossy rocks if you ask me. Why do you think no one comes back? What's out here?" Oliff stopped in his tracks at the base of a large root which hung over an enormous chasm. He peered over the side. "Partly because of the forest itself. They say it comes alive and swallows men whole, which is quite possibly completely ridiculous. But mostly on account of the beast at Tuksa, I suppose." He turned around and held out his walking stick toward Mao and gave it a shake. Mao looked at his own torch and saw that it had nearly died out. He handed it over, and Oliff began to wrap a fresh, oily cloth around it, invigorating the flame once more. Mao looked around into the darkness while he waited. "You mentioned that before, but it was a long time ago." He paused for a moment and squinted his eyes. "What do you think it really is?" "Well, no one knows, really. Some say it's a dragon, 60 feet tall," Oliff said. "Others say it's a wolf with 12 tails swirling like the arms of a vortex behind him. Either way, I'd be content in never finding out the truth of it." They heard a tree crack in the distance, and all three of them immediately spun their heads in that direction. Oliff kept his eyes fixed and slowly handed the freshly spun torch back to Mao. "Let's talk about something else." He patted the boy on his back and then helped him and Bartol up onto the gigantic twisted tree root. "Come on, Barty, let's go. Up, up," he said with a whistle. Mud caked up over the surface of the wood, making it nearly impossible to keep their footing. As they proceeded along its surface, it seemed more and more that the immense twisted tree limbs were all that held the forest floor together. At any moment everything might fall away into the emptiness below. The narrow walkway that they now stood upon wound under and through clumps of earth and splintered tree branches. It was unclear where one tree ended and the other ones began. Chasms opened into an abyss beneath them, until they had lost all bearing and could not determine this way from that. Oliff split his attention between finding solid footing in front of him and catching Mao every time he slipped over the side behind him, which happened several times. He was braver than any kid he'd ever seen, but it terrified him that such bravery would earn him a broken neck someday. They inched along the narrow limb at a cautious pace, and gradually the mist began to clear. When Oliff looked down, he noticed something strange. The moss beneath him spiked in the most peculiar fashion, almost as if it were hanging up, Oliff murmured in a perplexed tone. His eyes followed the path spiraling around a large structure hanging in its center, and that's when he saw it. Just hanging there, upside down, right in front of them. Oliff held his hand up behind him and gave a soft, sharp whistle. Then, without looking away, he removed the notebook from his pocket and unfolded a small piece of paper to reveal a scribbled map. He moved his finger along a path from Tuksa, through the forest, to a symbol of a cabin coiled in a tree root. He held it up in front of him, narrowing his eyes at the paper, and then just beyond it, until the drawing on the map matched the shape of the inverted structure. "This is the spot," he said as he let out a sigh of relief. "Ha ha! Leave it to the old man to map out even this cursed place." He tucked the book back into his coat and turned back and smiled at Mao, who stood cocking one eyebrow and scratching the back of his head. Bartol barked excitedly and spun around in a very small circle.